Agentic medicine, the end of medical software as we know it. There is a strange paradox in the way artificial intelligence is currently entering medicine. The technology is becoming extraordinarily powerful. Large language models can reason, summarize, interpret, retrieve information, generate structured content, and increasingly interact with software systems. And yet, in everyday general practice, the most visible application of AI is often transcription. A consultation is recorded. The conversation is converted into text. The text is turned into a clinical note. And that is certainly useful. But perhaps it is also a sign that the medical profession is beginning its journey with AI at exactly the wrong end. Because the most valuable part of a medical consultation is not what is said. It is what is thought. A clinician listens to a patient and simultaneously performs an enormous amount of silent cognitive work. What matters? What does not matter? What is missing? What is inconsistent? What needs to be examined? What needs to be investigated? What can safely be ignored? What is the differential diagnosis? What is the level of risk? Much of this never becomes language. The physical examination is often largely silent. The clinician's reasoning is largely silent. And therefore, what remains silent cannot be transcribed. This creates an interesting problem. An AI-generated transcript can produce a very long clinical note while containing relatively little of the thing that actually matters most, clinical reasoning. A long note with a short clinical value. And this is not necessarily a criticism of transcription technology. It is a criticism of the role that has been assigned to AI. If artificial intelligence is introduced primarily as a machine that writes down what the doctor says, then the technology is being used to automate the documentation surrounding clinical thinking. But the much bigger opportunity is to automate almost everything around clinical thinking. And there is an extraordinary amount of that. Consider a typical general practice. There are patients whose weight has not been recorded recently. Blood pressure is missing. Screening information is incomplete. Laboratory monitoring is overdue. A chronic disease review is due. A recall needs to be performed. A repeat blood test needs to be ordered. A patient needs to be informed. A result needs to be followed up. A prescription is approaching its renewal date. A specialist referral needs to be prepared. An appointment needs to be organized. A patient needs to be reminded. And after all of this, someone has to notice that these things need to happen in the first place. Modern medical software is remarkably good at displaying these problems. A red dot appears. A warning appears. A task appears. A dashboard turns amber. And then, implicitly, the software says, "There is a problem. Now deal with it." That is not autonomy. That is notification. The clinician remains the operating system. This is where an entirely different model becomes possible. Imagine a medical practice in which software is no longer primarily a database with menus, tabs, forms, and alerts. Instead, imagine a collection of specialized AI agents operating continuously in the background. One agent could be responsible for maintaining the patient's basic clinical data. It knows that weight should be current. It knows that blood pressure should be recorded. It knows which screening parameters are relevant. If something is missing, it does not merely display a warning. It acts. It might contact the patient. It might ask for the information. It might request a home measurement. Or, if appropriate, it might arrange an appointment with a practice nurse. Another agent could manage recalls. It knows which patients require monitoring. It knows when laboratory testing is due. It can generate the appropriate request, communicate with the patient, monitor completion, and identify what remains outstanding. Another agent could monitor follow-up. Another could monitor chronic medication renewals. Another could prepare administrative documentation. Another could manage referrals. And these agents would not simply suggest tasks. They would execute them. From beginning to end. That distinction is fundamental. The difference between a conventional alert system and an agentic system is the difference between saying, "This needs to be done," and saying, "This has been done." The clinician should not have to become the human middleware connecting dozens of disconnected software functions. The software should do that. And this leads to an even more radical change. If the software becomes capable of understanding natural language and executing actions, perhaps the traditional graphical interface becomes largely unnecessary. No more searching through menus. No more remembering which tab contains the blood results. No more wondering where the referral function is hidden. No more learning the software instead of practicing medicine. The primary interface could simply be a conversation. Voice or text. A clinician might say, "Show me the last 3 consultations and summarize the clinically relevant changes." And the system produces exactly that. What is the current weight, blood pressure, chronic disease list, medications, and latest blood results? They appear. Show me today's consultations. They appear in the preferred format, with direct access to the relevant history. Not because a particular button was pressed, but because the clinician asked. The interface adapts to the clinician rather than forcing the clinician to adapt to the interface. And consider documentation. A clinician could dictate naturally. Persistent right knee pain for 6 weeks. No trauma. Worse on stairs. Examination. Mild effusion. Flex ion limited to approximately 110 degrees. No instability. The system does not merely transcribe this sentence. It understands it. It identifies the clinical concepts. It extracts the relevant parameters. It places them into the appropriate structured fields in the medical record. The database remains structured. But the interface no longer needs to be. The clinician communicates naturally. The software performs the structuring. And perhaps the most interesting part is that the system does not need to replace the doctor. It needs to protect the doctor's time and attention. The division of labor becomes very clear. The machine manages information. The machine manages workflows. The machine monitors processes. The machine retrieves data. The machine performs repetitive administrative reasoning. The machine communicates with patients within defined boundaries. The machine coordinates multiple steps. And the clinician does what remains uniquely valuable. Clinical judgment. Diagnosis. Risk assessment. Physical examination. Communication. Empathy. Decision-making under uncertainty. In other words, AI should not initially be used to remove the human from the part of medicine that requires the most human judgment. It should remove the human from everything that does not require it. This is what makes the concept of agentic medical software fundamentally different from simply adding an LLM to an existing electronic medical record. An LLM embedded in a traditional system is still an assistant living inside old software. An agentic system changes the architecture itself. The medical record becomes the source of truth. The LLM becomes the reasoning and language layer. Agents become the execution layer. And the clinician becomes the supervisor of the system rather than its manual operator. That is a profound change. It is not merely a better electronic health record. It is a different model of software. And it is tempting to describe this as something belonging to the distant future. But technically, very little of this is science fiction. The components already exist. Large language models exist. Speech recognition exists. Structured clinical databases exist. ARPAs exist. Workflow engines exist. Authentication exists. Audit trails exist. Agent frameworks exist. What is missing is not necessarily a technological breakthrough. What is missing is the decision to assemble these technologies around a fundamentally different philosophy of medical software. There are, of course, serious requirements. Patient privacy cannot be an afterthought. Clinical safety cannot be an afterthought. Every autonomous action needs appropriate permissions, boundaries, auditability, and human oversight. And for healthcare, there is an additional strategic issue. The underlying intelligence should ideally be controlled within an appropriate national or regional infrastructure. Sensitive clinical data should not become dependent on the geopolitical decisions of whoever happens to operate the world's largest cloud platform. A sovereign or locally controlled AI infrastructure therefore becomes not merely a technical preference, but potentially part of healthcare resilience. And naturally, a country as future-oriented as New Zealand must surely be preparing for this. Perhaps several enormous AI data centers are already nearing completion. Perhaps. Or perhaps the future-oriented part still requires a little more work. But the important point is this. The technology is no longer the limiting factor. The limiting factor is imagination. The question is no longer whether AI can write the clinical note. The much more important question is, why should the clinician have to perform all the other work in the first place? The future of medical software may therefore not be a smarter version of today's software. It may be the disappearance of software as something the clinician has to operate. No menus. No tabs. No endless dashboards. No red dots waiting for someone to notice them. Just a clinical environment in which information is continuously organized, missing tasks are autonomously identified, routine processes are executed, and the clinician can simply ask for what is needed. The computer stops saying, "Here is your software. Learn how to use it." And starts saying, "Tell me what needs to happen. I will take care of the rest." That is the real promise of agentic medicine. Not artificial intelligence replacing the doctor. Something considerably more useful. Artificial intelligence removing everything that never needed a doctor in the first place.